Hey folks, I'm Gene Delasalo with Audioholics, and today we're going to look at the Anthem STR Preamp and Power Amp separate 2-channel units. I want to go over all of my detailed measurements and analysis on these products. I will be doing one more video on this product focusing on setting up Anthem ARC room correction, and then I will be doing a full written review, and I'll link up all these videos, and I'll link up the written review in these videos so you can kind of look through all this data that I've been collecting for the last couple of months. I've really been enjoying these products. I'm a little bit eager, and that's why I've been doing all these different videos. I just want to show you guys how great this stuff is. So without further ado, why don't we look at the measurement report that I put together. And here we do have the Anthem STR Preamp, which retails for $4,000. And the STR Power Amp, which retails for $6,000. They're both available in silver or black. My units came in black, as per my request. So I just want to go over, starting out with the preamp, on everything that I found here. Of course, I'm using my Audio Precision APX 585 8-channel HDMI audio analyzer to do all my measurements. The line conditions are at 20 amps, 120 volts. I monitor the line conditions when I do power tests to make sure there isn't appreciable line sag, to make sure we get the most power possible. So let's start with the preamp. You can see here that Anthem claims that the preamp has 3.3 volts RMS out on the RCA and 6.6 volts RMS on the balanced, and that's unclipped. I verified that with my scope. It was still well below the minimum distortion I'd like to see at under 1%, so it wasn't clipping. I did verify that. And I like to see Fft analysis of outputs to see how noisy and if there's any misbehavior with multi-tones or anything like that, you know, spewing off of the 1 kilohertz tone here. And you can see that this thing is squeaky clean. And what I like to do is I like to measure a 2 volts RMS output, because that's usually the amount of voltage you need to drive most power amps into clipping. And you can see here, this thing was great at a 2 volts RMS output. The second order harmonic was down by 104 dB. That's just an excellent result there. And everything here is really clean. The noise floor is about minus 120 dB. I have nothing really to complain about here. That's some of the best I've seen in preamp kind of measurements. So I wanted to also show you the difference you get in distortion when comparing analog direct versus engaging the DSP. This product's really slick in the fact that it has a 32-bit, 192 kilohertz analog to digital converter, and it'll take any input and it'll convert it to digital if you want to apply ARC, or if you just want to do any type of audio processing aside, like bass management, whatever you want to do. So a lot of people are kind of concerned that that might lose fidelity as a result. Well, I wanted to show you this interesting result that I got here. I basically measured analog direct, which is the blue line, and then I measured it with the DSP engaged. And you could see the distortion was excellent in both cases. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. Even with the DSP engaged, we're talking well under 0.005% THD. That's an incredible result. That's definitely below audibility. You're not going to have a problem with that. You can see this is a really transparent D to A or A to D converter in this case. And the bandwidth, I will show you the next measurement, I believe, yes. Okay. I wanted to check the bandwidth next. And if you look at the analog direct outputs, it's basically, it exceeds the bandwidth of my test gear. My test gear is flat to 80 kilohertz, and that's it. Without the DSP engaged, it's like a straight line all the way to the limits of my bandwidth here. Now, with the DSP engaged, you do get a little roll-off because of the A to D conversion, but it's the 2.5 dB point is at 78 kilohertz. Not even Batman could hear at those frequencies. In fact, not even a bat probably could hear at those frequencies. So we're talking about a very linear response here, whether you're using the pure direct or using the analog to digital converter. That's an excellent result that you see there. You don't have to worry about losing any fidelity by doing your analog to digital conversion, especially if you're going to use some of the Phono Preamp modes that we'll talk about in a little bit. So here's another cool thing I did. I took one thing I love about this product is it has a home theater bypass mode. So in my situation, I have a rack of equipment for my home theater, and then I have the 2-channel rack. This product allows me to interface those two, so I'm always using that STR amp, whether it's in 2-channel mode or whether it's in home theater mode. And it basically has a set of relays that once you engage the home theater bypass mode, you engage it by shutting the STR off, and you hear the relays click over. And it gives you a straight through connection between your preamp from your AV processor straight through to the STR preamp and into the STR power amp. Now, I know people would worry that you're going to lose fidelity there. So what I did was I compared that home theater bypass mode to basically a straight through cable, my test cable on my Audio Precision. And you can see there's no difference in frequency response. It's a straight line for the entire bandwidth of my gear. And then if you look at the FFT here, which is distortion profile, it's identical, no difference. The only harmonics you're seeing here is basically a limit of my test gear. My test gear only goes to minus 120 dB before you start seeing these distortion products, which is still incredible. But it is a measurement that is a function of my test gear, not a function of the Anthem STR Preamp. So basically what I'm trying to tell you guys is home theater bypass is like a straight through cable. No ground loop issues, nothing. I didn't have any problems with it. It's awesome that they have this feature. Very few 2-channel preamps offer this. I'm very happy about that. Now I wanted to show you the bass management. And I just set it for 80 hertz, basically. You can see that the high pass filter is 12 dB per octave, and the low pass filter is 24 dB per octave. At 80 hertz, the minus 6 dB point on the low pass is 80 hertz, and at the high pass is minus 3 dB at 80 hertz. This is a perfect slope you would get in a THX certified product. The bass management here is awesome. It's better than I've seen in a lot of AVRs these days. It's just really cool that they even have bass management like this. And if you want to take advantage of it, rest assured you're going to get perfect integration between the high pass and the low pass if this is what you're looking for. So I wanted to also show you the SNR, the signal-to-noise ratio. That's how quiet the preamp is when you're driving very low signal versus hearing a loud signal. At 1 volt RMS, I measured 1 volt RMS in and 2 volts RMS out. I measured 106 dB A-weighted and 110 dB when driving a digital source with a 0 dBFS signal. Basically at the same 2 volts RMS output. That's very good, very low noise floor. I like to see, when I do these tests on all products, I like to see at least 90 dB, so you got plenty of margin here. These preamps are very clean, very quiet. Now Anthem claims 120 dB A-weighted for unbalanced and 118 for balanced, but that's all because of how they're driving their inputs. I try to drive, you know, at 1 volt in, 2 volts out, or usually 200 millivolts in, 2 volts out, depends on what kind of a test I'm doing. But they're kind of cranking up the input voltage to get you better SNR. I don't think that's a realistic way of doing it because nobody's putting 4 volts in and only driving 2 volts out in real world scenarios. But it is great for specmanship. It shows you what the system is really capable of. It's just a matter of how they're speccing it versus a matter of how I spec it. But every one of the measurements I took, I went to the Anthem's website, and I basically tried to recreate their measurements to get their results. And I've never had a problem getting their results. In fact, their engineers were always in communication with me. They actually have the same test gear I have. They have the same HDMI audio analyzer from Audio Precision. So it made it really easy for me to compare my measurements with them and to even send them my test file if I had any problems. That's cool because a lot of companies don't invest in that kind of test gear, and it's great to see that Anthem does. So the only weird thing I found out was the balanced versus unbalanced outputs. Typically on a scenario when you have a preamp that has balanced and unbalanced, you should see 6 dB hotter on the balanced than you do on the unbalanced. And then on the amp side, you should see 6 dB lower on the balanced to offset that. In this case, they didn't do that, and I've never measured a balanced preamp that doesn't give you a 6 dB boost on the balanced outputs. And they admitted that they weren't really sure why that was the case. I think it was to help alleviate consumer confusion about why the levels are different. I was confused that the levels weren't different. I wasn't really a fan of the fact that the outputs, whether you're on balanced or unbalanced, were the same. I don't know, it's just weird. I don't think it's a showstopper by any means. It's just something I wanted to note to you guys. The other thing I also noted was, even though this is a balanced amplifier and a balanced preamplifier, the preamp does not keep that differential signal from input to output. Anthem claims that they convert it for better common mode noise rejection. I'm not sure I really agree with that. I tend to really like to keep everything differential. Back in my telecoms day, that's how I used to do design circuits. And when you do have everything differential, you should see a 6 dB noise improvement. I only saw a 3 dB noise improvement with the balanced versus the unbalanced because of the conversion factor. Again, we're picking nits here because the preamp measurements, the distortion, SNR, frequency response, are all stellar. Some of the best I've measured to date. So I'm just basically, I don't know, I'm just being a little bit anal retentive, I guess. So let me show you the STR Crosstalk. This is basically the channel-to-channel isolation. I like to see about 60 dB of isolation at 20 kilohertz. You know, that's a good receiver will almost never even give you 60 dB at 20 kilohertz. But that to me is a good number. You get good stereo separation. Anthem kind of blew that out of the water here. As you can see, the worst channel gave us 95 dB of stereo separation at 20 kilohertz. That's awesome. I mean, that's going to give you like almost monoblock kind of performance. That's a good number to see here. There's definitely no problem with crosstalk with this preamp. I want to show you the Phono preamp here. Phono is pretty cool because you have, not only do you have the standard RIAA curve, but you have custom curves depending on what kind of vinyl you spin. Anthem put that into the product. So what I did was I took the inverse RIAA curve and put it into my audio precision so I could measure a linear response from the Phono preamp using the moving magnet output. And you can see here it's very linear. It's what you expect from a good Phono preamp, flat from 10 hertz out to 20 kilohertz. And then I took that curve and I normalized it and compared it to the other settings that Anthem offers, just for comparative purposes to show you what the various curves give you. So depending on the kind of vinyl you're spinning, you might want to choose one of these other curves. Again, in order to do this, you've got to now convert the analog signal to digital, and I've already established the A to D converters on this preamp are excellent, so it's not something to worry about. But you can see some of these curves, they give you a little bass boost, and some of them give you a little treble boost and a little treble cut. I didn't really mess a whole lot when I was doing my listening tests with these different curves. I do have some older vinyl from Miles Davis I might go back and revisit and see if these other curves improve the fidelity. But I just wanted to point out that the measurements here are excellent. I did a THD versus distort versus frequency measurements here out of the Phono preamp. Excellent again. Look how low this distortion is, below 0.005%. This is out of a Phono preamp, so it's really good. And I also compared it to using the analog converters. Again, when you convert from analog to digital, you're still down in the mud here. This is incredible performance. Anthem really put their efforts into doing things right, into giving you a clean analog and a clean digital section as well. So I'm very impressed there. I measured the SNR. Again, we're at 93 dB. That's with 2 volts RMS out. Now Anthem specs this at 110 dB, and that's because they were driving the input with 90 millivolts. I didn't drive the input with 90 millivolts. You're never going to get that kind of signal coming off of a Phono cartridge. That's a huge signal for Phono. In fact, if you drive this thing with 90 millivolts, it's not linear at 20 kilohertz. It's only linear at 1 kilohertz. So when I check inputs and outputs, I always make sure there's linearity on the input when I use the test signal and all the way out to the output. If you exceeded, I noted if you exceeded more than 30 millivolts on the input, then the high frequencies roll off at 20K. That's just a limitation of the technology. It's not a limitation from Anthem by any means. But like I said, a realistic test condition was 10 millivolts RMS input. To get my 2 volts output, I cranked up the volume and I got a 93 dB SNR A-weighted. That's an excellent result. Nothing to complain about here. I've tested a few Phono preamps over the years. One really good one from Marantz, and this is right up there in performance. And I'm glad to see that Anthem's taken vinyl seriously, especially when you're buying a 2-channel gear like this and it's very expensive. You know people are going to throw a turntable in there. So rest assured the Anthem phono section is excellent. They have a moving magnet and a moving coil section, so if you want to use that, you can as well. So let's get into the STR Power Amp now. And I basically test distortion and I test power in 3 different ways. I test continuous full power bandwidth, which you don't see in the magazines. Most magazines will only test at 1 kilohertz. They'll do the power sweep test, I call it. I actually test full power bandwidth, which is what is the FTC used to spec back in the old days when they used to police amplifier measurements and amplifier claims. They don't enforce that as much now as they used to. So a lot of companies are making nebulous claims. So we try to keep them honest. We do the continuous full power bandwidth tests. So that's when you see this CFW-BW from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, 8 ohms and 4 ohms. I do the 1 kilohertz power sweep versus distortion test. That's what you see in the print magazines and online most places. And then I do a dynamic power test. And that's a burst test. That kind of simulates program material, music program material. It gives you an idea of how much headroom there is in the power supply. And just, you know, to show you how much this amp can really drive out power when you're doing music peaks. And I don't use a variac to hold the line voltage up, but I do use a voltmeter to make sure we don't sag the line. So if my line is normally 120 volts, if I start sagging below about 116 or 118 volts, then I note that in the review that my test might be limited by line sag. Did not have that problem in this case because I have a 20 amp line, and this amplifier is not powerful enough to use up full 20 amp of current. So I got very accurate results here. So with the continuous full power bandwidth, this amp is rated at 400 watts. I got 422 watts at 8 ohms full bandwidth, and I got a whopping 622 watts at 4 ohms full bandwidth, and this is rated at 600 watts. So this margin here, this is very clean. When I do continuous full power bandwidth, I make sure that the amplifier is under 1%, under 0.1% THD. So that's well under clipping. That's a good signal. You won't see any square waves if you put an O-scope on it when you're doing these tests. It's very conservative. So there's more power here than I'm showing, and this is a very impressive result out of a 2-channel amp. Then I did the power sweep tests, and that's that 1 kilohertz. So with both channels driven at 8 ohms, it put out almost 470 watts at 0.1% and 493 watts at 1% distortion. Again, that's a very good rating because it's beyond what the manufacturer claims. Had no problem driving my speakers. I will note this one thing, and I'll show you in the power table. They rate this amplifier at 800 watts at 2 ohms. I could not do a power sweep test without the fault protection kicking on. It's a DC fault. I know Anthem's trying to really protect this thing because the outputs are bridged. So when you have a bridged amplifier, that 2 ohm load now looks like a 1 ohm load to those amplifiers. So they're just trying to be very cautious not to overdrive this amp. In real world scenario, my reference speakers, the Status 8T from RBH, they dip down to 2 ohms into the bass region, and I belted the snot out of these out of this amplifier with my speakers, just blasting bass intense music. Never had the amp go into fault protect mode. In fact, the hottest I can make the amp go was like 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And I consulted with Anthem, and they're like, "Oh, that's nothing. You're fine because you could go another 20 or 30 degrees, and you're, you know, to get that amplifier going before you start worrying about overdriving it." In fact, after hours of playing the amp, I'd put my hand on the top of the chassis, and it was warm, but it wasn't like going to burn my skin or anything like that. So this amplifier definitely has balls, I'd like to say. It could drive pretty much any speaker on the market. If it could drive my Status ATs, it'll probably drive, you know, those giant electrostats as well. So we did the continuous full power bandwidth test. We did the 1 kilohertz sweep test. Next is the dynamic burst, and we got an impressive kilowatt of power with both channels driven here, and that's at 4 ohms at less than 1%. That's a lot of power, guys. There's some good margin here in this amplifier. So I want to show you the power table here, and you can see all the results. Again, we did the continuous full power. I did it at one channel just to show you. It's 450 watts. At 2 channels at 8 ohms, it's 422, like we said. at 2 channels driven, 4 ohm, 622, and then I have all the various kilohertz sweep tests, whether it's 1 channel driven at 0.1%, 1%, whether it's 8 ohms, 4 ohms. I pretty much did every combination of power you could dream of with a 2-channel amplifier, and you can see this thing means business. I mean, they have good power in this amplifier. The parts are there because you've got 2 giant toroids in here. You got a lot of capacitance, power supply capacitance. You got the amplifier in bridge configuration. So it means business. And like I said, it's an efficient design. It only weighs about 60 pounds. This is a pretty powerful amplifier for a Class AB that you could actually pick up. One person can pick this thing up. It's not going to, you know, break my back at least. Then I wanted to show you really what's important about an amplifier is how clean it is at low power, because most of the time amplifiers spend is at low power. So I wanted to show you the FFT at 1 watt, and you can see it's excellent here. With a 1 kilohertz sine wave, you basically, your third harmonic is the dominant, but it's 102 dB below the fundamental. That's an excellent result here. You can see this is a clean amplifier. I could see a lot of switching amps would give you a lot of noise here, and sometimes I'd have to use a preconditioning filter to filter that out. You don't have to do that with a linear amp, and this is just really good, really clean amplifier design. I like what I'm seeing. And then I did a crosstalk test here as well, and you could see at 20 kilohertz we're at 90 dB again, which was pretty close to what the STR preamp was. So we're approaching monoblock performance here in a 2-channel chassis. I think that's excellent. So yeah, I have very little to complain about with this amplifier or the preamp. I think both units are state-of-the-art. I think the feature set that they give you is awesome. There's very few 2-channel preamps on the market that, number 1, have that home theater bypass mode. Number 2, have the analog to digital converters that they take seriously and they give you state-of-the-art performance. Number 3, they give you awesome bass management with adjustable crossovers. And number 4, you get the awesome Anthem ARC room correction system that I'll be doing a separate video on with measurements and show you and give you tips on how to set this thing up, because you do have to play around with it to get the best possible sound. And there's just so many configuration options in this preamp. You can create up to 30 different sources if you want to compare ARC versus no ARC, or if you just want to label different sources to do different things. It's amazing flexibility what you get with these products. I know they're not cheap, but they're crafted in Canada, they're designed in Canada, and they're built in Canada, and they're built to a very high standard. If you look at the internals of these units, they're very clean layouts, very high quality part count, and the measurements speak for themselves, guys. It was a pleasure to measure this in a sea of mediocrity, what I've seen in most home theater lately. It's great when you get a good 2-channel rig like this, and it's just a pleasure to measure. There's no surprises. And most importantly, I spent over a month listening to this stuff, and I've been loving what I've been hearing. I've been spinning vinyl, I've been spinning SACDs, I've been doing digital music sources from my hard drive, and nothing failed to impress me. I've really enjoyed the STR experience. You will be reading more about this in my formal review, and you will be getting more information on how to set up Anthem ARC. So even if you don't have an STR in your rack, you're going to benefit if you have an STR processor or if you have an STR receiver, because the premise of ARC is the same in all products. So I'm going to spend some good time talking about that with you guys. So stay tuned for the next installment of our STR series of videos. I hope you found this informative. Please let me know down below what you're doing for 2-channel audio. Do you have a separate rig, or are you doing it off your home theater? Do you aspire to have a 2-channel rig? Give me some feedback of what you guys are using for 2-channel, and if 2-channel is your thing or not. I'd like to know. And guys, until next time, keep listening.